Jonathan Blake thought he had his life under control, until his empire crumbled, exposed by its ties to crime. But the real shock came when he learned that behind it all was his own daughter, rejected and forgotten. What happens next will astound even those who thought they had seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. Jonathan Blake was a man who had grown accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life. He knew the value of every dollar he earned and every person in his orbit. Born into a poor family in one of Texas's backwater towns, Jonathan realized at an early age that the only thing that could change his fate was money, and he was willing to do anything to get it. Starting with a small oil business, he grew his company over the years into a true oil giant. Friends and colleagues called him the King of Oil. His entire life was memorialized in luxury: beachfront mansions, private jets, and a collection of rare cars. Jonathan lived as if he were royalty. Magazines wrote about him as one of the most influential people in the country. Forbes regularly listed him among the wealthiest Americans, and cameras followed his every move. But behind this facade of success was a man who, deep down, was still that boy from Texas, obsessed with the fear of losing it all. That fear drove him to achieve more, but it also made him suspicious and distrustful of those around him. He controlled every aspect of his empire, leaving no room for chance. He was convinced he knew every detail, every deal, every contract, every dollar. So, when on his 60th birthday he received a strange letter, his first reaction was a mixture of disdain and disbelief. The plain white envelope, personally delivered to his office, was unremarkable except for one thing. It had no return address. Jonathan quickly tore it open, expecting to find some congratulation or an invitation to yet another elite event. But inside was just a single sheet of paper with one phrase: "Your empire is built on lies." Those words detonated in his mind. At first, Blake was sure it was just another scare tactic. He'd seen such tricks many times before. Competitors, journalists, even politicians occasionally tried to tarnish his name. But this felt different. The words were written in neat, confident handwriting. There was no emotion, no threat, no hint of blackmail. It was simply a statement of fact. Jonathan put the letter aside, but it lingered in his thoughts. That evening, as he continued dining with friends and business partners, his mind kept drifting back to that strange message. He was sure it was just a silly joke. But something began to stir within him. It was an odd, unsettling feeling, as if something dark had risen from the depths of his consciousness. The next day, Jonathan ordered his bodyguards and lawyers to launch an investigation. He wanted to find out who could have sent the letter and why. His team set to work diligently, but over the next few weeks, all their efforts to track down the sender led nowhere. No one knew who could be behind the message. Every lead turned into a dead end. With each passing day, Blake's anxiety grew. He wasn't the kind of man who left questions unanswered. His empire, which he had built over decades, was sacred to him. But now, doubt had taken root in his mind. Could someone know something he didn't? Weeks passed since the mysterious letter arrived, and Jonathan Blake's unease only intensified. He hoped the investigation led by his lawyers and security would yield some results, but the team, accustomed to handling competitors and adversaries, hit a brick wall. No one could explain where the letter came from. It was as if it had materialized out of nowhere, with a ghost standing behind it, invisible to everyone except Jonathan. During this time, Jonathan began personally reviewing certain aspects of his business. For a man who had always controlled every step of his company, it was strange that now he felt so lost in his own paperwork. He decided to go back to the beginning of his business, to the contracts that laid the foundation of his empire. Blake couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. He wanted to make sure that all the deals he was proud of were legitimate and transparent. But as he opened the old documents, anxiety overcame him. The first signs of trouble appeared almost immediately. The contracts Jonathan had signed in the early days of his career looked different from how he remembered. He was a man with an exceptional memory, always attentive to detail, but now before him lay documents with small, yet noticeable, discrepancies. The dates didn't match, the wording was different, and strangest of all, his own signature appeared slightly altered. It was his signature, but in some papers, the letters looked more angular than usual, while in others, they were unusually smooth. Jonathan knew something was wrong. This wasn't just a simple filing error. His empire had always prided itself on flawless documentation. He pulled out more recent contracts, those involving major deals and strategically important partnerships, and the pattern repeated itself. The deeper he delved into the documents, the more questions arose. Some of these contracts had been critical to the company's success, and they were the very ones that helped Blake rise to the top. But now he began to doubt if those deals had been made the way he had always thought. In that moment, he thought of Harrison, his longtime partner. George Harrison had been with Jonathan from the very beginning, from the days when they had nothing but ambition and a few $1,000s in startup capital. Jonathan trusted him like no one else. Harrison had always been by his side when tough decisions had to be made, and was always ready to shoulder part of the responsibility. He was the man who signed most of the documents while Blake was focused on expanding the business. With this in mind, Jonathan decided to discuss his findings with Harrison. However, Harrison started avoiding meetings. First, he blamed a busy schedule, then urgent trips abroad. This was unusual for a man who had always been available. Jonathan began asking more questions within his inner circle. He tried to find out who else had been involved in those early deals, but the more he asked, the more vague responses and evasions he received. It turned out that key figures in his company, including the CFO and the chief legal officer, were either on vacation or unable to give clear explanations. His suspicions grew with each passing day. Jonathan tried to contact Harrison directly, but his calls and messages went unanswered. This behavior was completely uncharacteristic for the man he had known for so many years. Thoughts began to swirl in his head. Had Harrison been playing his own game behind Jonathan's back all along? But if so, why? And why was everything coming to light now? One couldn't help but wonder. Were these strange inconsistencies part of something much bigger, something that had been in motion since the very beginning of his success? Jonathan suddenly realized that maybe he had never controlled his empire the way he thought he had. Jonathan Blake, deeply immersed in investigating his business connections, didn't immediately notice the changes in his son Alex's behavior. Alex had never shown any interest in the family business. Since childhood, he had been surrounded by luxury, enjoying it without a second thought about where the money came from. Jonathan had always considered this normal. His son lived the life Jonathan would have wanted for himself if he had had the choice. Alex didn't know what it was like to fight for every dollar, and Jonathan was glad he had been able to give his son the chance to avoid the life he himself had been forced to live. But everything changed in the last few months. Alex suddenly started appearing at the company offices more frequently, attending meetings, listening in on deal discussions, and asking far too many questions. This was unusual for Blake. Alex had always been a fan of living large. Expensive parties, yachts, world travel. That's what occupied his time. Now, though, he seemed suddenly interested in the intricacies of running the company, which he'd never shown any concern for before. At first, Jonathan thought it was just a passing interest. Maybe his son had finally decided to get involved in the family business. After all, Jonathan knew that one day Alex would have to take his place, and such involvement could be beneficial. But something about Alex's behavior began to worry Blake. Alex wasn't just interested in the business. He was asking too many specific questions, often about the very old deals that had recently caught Jonathan's attention. One night during a family dinner, Jonathan noticed Alex discussing their financial assets with other family members in an unusually intense manner. In his eyes was not just interest, but a determination that hadn't been there before. When Jonathan tried to talk to his son directly and find out why he had suddenly become so interested in the business, Alex dodged the questions. He merely smiled and said something vague about needing to understand how things worked, since one day it would all be his. But Jonathan couldn't be fooled. Something wasn't right, and that something came to light one night. Alex came home late and unleashed a furious tirade at his father, a scene no one had expected. Angry and with visible pain in his eyes, he started accusing Jonathan of stealing his future. He ranted that everything they had was built on lies, and that his father had destroyed their family for the sake of money. Alex shouted that Jonathan had always put business above family, that money had become more important to him than the people he loved, and that it was Jonathan who had torn their family apart. His son's words cut Jonathan like a knife. He stood there, completely stunned. How could this be? Where was Alex getting this information? How could his own son suggest that everything Jonathan had accomplished was somehow connected to something dirty? Jonathan had always prided himself on providing for his family, giving them everything they could ever want. But now his son was accusing him of destroying the family for the sake of wealth. "You don't even understand what you've done," Alex yelled, his voice filled with rage. "You thought money could replace everything? You thought wealth could cover up all the lies. You destroyed our lives." "What are you talking about?" Jonathan finally managed to ask, trying to regain control of the situation. "What money? What lies?" But Alex just shook his head, and without giving his father any details, he stormed off to his room, leaving Jonathan feeling utterly helpless. His own son, the person he trusted more than anyone in the world, clearly knew something Jonathan didn't. What could it be? What was Alex hiding? And most importantly, where was he getting this information? These questions haunted Blake throughout the night. He knew that his son wouldn't have caused such a scene without reason. There was truth behind Alex's words, and Jonathan was determined to uncover it. It all started with one phone call. Jonathan sat in his office, lost in thought about recent events. The scene with Alex, the strange letter, and the fruitless investigations. His mind swirled with unanswered questions. The phone ringing seemed to jolt him back to reality. On the other end of the line was his lawyer, and the fear in his voice was unmistakable, as he told Jonathan that several of the company's major contracts were now under scrutiny from tax authorities and organized crime investigators. Jonathan couldn't believe his ears. His business, the one he was so proud of, was now linked to money laundering and dealings with criminal syndicates. At first, he wanted to dismiss it as just another attack from competitors or a political hit job. But the more details that surfaced, the clearer the reality became. These deals were real, and they directly involved his company. He had no idea someone could have used his business for such schemes. He immediately called Harrison, hoping for an explanation. But Harrison didn't answer. He had been unreachable ever since the allegations started coming to light. Jonathan tried contacting other key figures in his company, but was met with the same silence. Blake understood that the situation was spiraling out of control, but he had no idea how serious the consequences would be. Soon, the information leaked to the press. Headlines blasted across the country. Blake's empire, a front for criminal deals. The articles were filled with damning accusations, quotes from official documents, and familiar company names tied to multi-million-dollar contracts he had signed. It turned out that some of these companies were shell entities, used for laundering money that ended up in criminal organizations. Jonathan was stunned. How could he, at the helm of his company for decades, have missed all this? His reputation, which he had built over many years, was crumbling at an alarming rate. Everything he had worked for, all his achievements, was now tainted by scandal. Companies he had partnered with began cutting ties one by one. Partners who once admired his business acumen now hurried to distance themselves from him, not wanting to be dragged into the mess. One of the major banks froze the company's accounts, and several others followed suit. Overnight, the financial stability Jonathan had been so proud of was in jeopardy. As his empire collapsed, his personal life also fell apart. Alex continued to accuse his father, insisting that Jonathan had brought all of this upon himself. Their conversations turned into a series of loud arguments and blame. Alex claimed he had known for a long time about the company's dirty dealings, but had been unable to prove it. He blamed his father for not listening to his concerns and for carrying on as if nothing could ever harm him. Jonathan was in shock. His son, with whom he had hoped to rebuild their relationship, now blamed him for the destruction of their family. Blake felt like a puppet that had been manipulated all these years behind the scenes. The people he had trusted, including his closest friend and partner Harrison, were involved in criminal schemes, using his name and company as cover. Jonathan had always been sure he controlled every deal, every document, every contract. But the truth was much darker. He hadn't just lost control. He had been a tool used by others, more cunning and ruthless than he could have ever imagined. Harrison disappeared as if he had never existed. Lawyers informed Jonathan that his longtime associate, whom he had known for decades, had been spotted boarding a flight to Switzerland. Jonathan realized that everything he had built was collapsing before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His name had become synonymous with disgrace. News reports and newspaper articles painted him as one of the main criminals, even though he hadn't known what was happening behind his back. But no one wanted to hear his excuses. In the eyes of the public, he was guilty, and his downfall was an example of how someone could fall from the highest peaks to the lowest depths. The empire Jonathan had spent decades building had crumbled to dust in just a few months. Jonathan Blake, the man who had been at the center of a whirlwind of business and fame for so many years, now felt like a trapped animal. Everything he had once considered unshakable was collapsing. His wealth dwindled by the day, his reputation was destroyed, and most painfully, his own son had turned against him, blaming him for all their woes. Jonathan was convinced there was nothing left that could hurt him more. But the final, most brutal blow was yet to come. Amidst all this disaster, Jonathan had completely forgotten about his daughter, Linda. She had disappeared from his life years ago, when she was only 20. Back then, Linda had been young, vibrant, and headstrong, but her relationship with her father had always been strained. Jonathan, always consumed with work, had paid little attention to Linda, often leaving her alone with feelings of loneliness and neglect. Linda had needed her father's support, but instead, all she received were cold looks and constant reproaches for not being serious enough. When she told her father of her intention to marry a young man whom Jonathan despised, their relationship finally broke down. Jonathan had opposed the marriage, and Linda, frustrated and hurt, left the house, cutting all ties with the family. Years passed and Linda was almost forgotten. Jonathan continued his life as if she had never existed. But now, with his empire on the verge of collapse, she made an unexpected visit. When Linda walked into his office, her appearance was like a ghost from the past, a person he had long forgotten. She looked different, confident, cold, and merciless. "Hello, Dad." Her voice was calm, but there was an icy harshness in it. Jonathan froze in place. He couldn't comprehend how his own daughter could be here, especially at this moment. But Linda wasn't there by accident. Her appearance wasn't a coincidence, and her words soon confirmed it. "I know you're wondering who's been destroying everything you've built," Linda continued, not waiting for his response. "All this time you thought it was your enemies, competitors, or even the people you trusted. But the real reason behind all of this is me." Jonathan felt a cold horror grip him. His own daughter? How could this be? He sat at his desk, unable to say a word, his heart pounding in his chest. He just stared at Linda, trying to process what she was saying. Linda, meanwhile, continued her story with chilling precision. "You think your empire is falling apart because of some mistakes or shady deals. But the truth is, I've been orchestrating all of it for years. The shell companies, the criminal deals, I created and cultivated them to bring you down. You were too busy to notice how I started manipulating your business. It all started the moment you threw me out of your life. You forgot about me, but I never forgot about you. All these years, I've been waiting for the right moment to strike. I created a trap, and you fell right into it. With every step you took, you only got closer to your own downfall." Her words hit Jonathan like a verdict. He understood that his daughter had acted with cold-blooded calculation, and that all the accusations against him were no accident. Linda had become the key player in his downfall, the person who, through front companies and criminal schemes, had dismantled everything he had ever built. "You were never a father to me," Linda continued, her voice now more emotional. "You were just a source of money, a man who used his influence to control other people's lives. You destroyed our family for the sake of your business. You thought you could buy love or replace it with power? But that's not how it works. Everything you built is a lie. I just helped you realize it." Every word from her pierced Jonathan like a knife. He felt the ground fall out from under him. His own daughter, the person he had ignored and underestimated, had become his greatest enemy. Her revenge had been brutal and merciless. Linda had planned every detail, ensuring that he himself would be the one to destroy his kingdom. Jonathan remained silent. Linda's accusations, her coldness, her plan, all of it echoed in his mind. He had lost not only his money and reputation, but also his family, his daughter. But the most terrifying realization was that he had been the cause of it all. His coldness, his obsession with power and money, had created the monster that now came back to destroy him. Linda turned and headed for the door, leaving Jonathan in complete devastation. Before leaving, she gave him one final look, full of contempt. "You always thought you had everything under control. Now you know the truth." She left, leaving him alone in the shattered world that had once been his pride. Jonathan was left with a single thought. He had lost everything: his money, his family, and most importantly, himself.